Hello and welcome to Steve and Dave's year-end review. This time we're going to be talking about 1973, taking a look at the news of the year and also the music of the year that was going on. Steve, you want to start us out?
I do. But just first, a question for you. So, if it's 1973, what's the population of the United States, do you think? And just for comparison, the population of the United States today is roughly 345 million. So, what do you think the population of the U.S. was in 73?
I think we're around 100 million at that point.
So, well, it's more than that. It's roughly 212 million.
Really? Oh,
Yeah,
because I remember seeing these figures from the early 70s and being surprised that it was as low as it was.
yeah.
So
To the notion here is, I think, an important one, that the United States is a third smaller in terms of population. And so, as we think about these events, um, it's worth noting that Americans, there were just fewer Americans to sort of absorb these things, consume
another way
them.
of saying it is that America is half as big again today as it was back then.
I think that's right. I mean, and so I think there still was a kind of common culture, a certain shared ideas that a wide swath of the public was engaged in. And so let's just jump into it. So if it's early 73, January 2nd, in fact, then the trial of Daniel Ellsberg is taking place. And Ellsberg is he's an important figure. He just passed away a few weeks ago here in the United States. But Ellsberg's an important figure in that he was a member of the Rand Corporation, kind of think tank, and had access to documents that outlined then the U.S. government's plans, expectations, and beliefs for the war in Southeast Asia. And what Ellsberg noted in these documents is that they weren't exactly what the talking points were for American government officials. And in fact, the Pentagon Papers were relatively pessimistic regarding American chances of success, whatever success would be, in Southeast Asia. And Ellsberg then took it upon himself then to kind of liberate these papers. And the New York Times famously published them, I think, in full, which then set off a huge flurry of legal cases, Supreme Court rulings. And Ellsberg, as we see here in this picture, was put on trial. It's interesting, though, that the charges against him were dropped in May. And so he was I mean, I think it's fair, Dave, to say that Ellsberg was a figure of great note in this time, and that Americans had kind of a split opinion of Ellsberg. Some saw him as a kind of patriot, a kind of a courageous figure.
Well,
And others
I think
thought
like
saw him as
Richard
a.
Nixon and John Mitchell were in that crowd, right? I mean,
I think not. No, I think not. It's because others saw him as nothing short of traitorous.
yeah.
And it's it it was his really kind of first brush with fame. I think it's, over the next 50 years, Ellsberg was, I think, elevated in American culture as a kind of truth teller, and was seen by people who were whistleblowers as a kind of hero. And I think many people, I think, would even suggest that Ellsberg was amongst the first of these so-called whistleblowers, that what he did really opened eyes to what the government what the government wasn't saying about the war in Vietnam.
Well,
And I think it helped erode the support for the war. No question about that.
let's be clear that what he did was illegal according to
That's right.
the laws
No,
of the
that's right.
time.
No question.
There was no provision for whistleblowing as a defense. This is an acceptable thing to do. So he really was going out on a limb. It was the New York Times. I thought it was the Washington Post that
The Times, the New York Times was the um, first to publish,
because the
and this
Washington
was actually.
Post also had a real knockdown drag out legal battle with the Nixon administration over.
Yes. Well, I mean, they did over the some of the Watergate articles. I'm not certain though past that. I know that because the Times was involved then with the Supreme Court case. The Times then the government sued, and this went to the Supreme Court in a quite a famous ruling.
Maybe I am thinking about Watergate.
But it's but the notion, Dave, that you raised there about whistleblowing, whistleblowing today is, I mean, it's protected in many ways. Whistleblowing, it's seen as an important,
at least
an
in
important
theory.
act, a real, and at least in theory, and it's considered, I think, today by many people a kind of noble act. In this era, it was rebellious, capital R.
Treason.
Treason, I think, capital T.
Treason for a lot of people.
Absolutely. Yeah, and I think a lot of people then, as high a regard that many people held Daniel Ellsberg. I mean, I think there's many people who thought of him as a walking traitor to the United States until the end of his life. Really split. Public opinion was really split about him. Let's move, if we could. So a couple of days later, the 5th of January, you start then the mandated screening of all airline passengers entering American planes. And so this is, I believe, day one in San Francisco of passengers passing through a magnetometer and then having their bags checked, including the bags that they were carrying on the plane. This had come in the wake of really a number of years of skyjackings.
A real rash of skyjacking.
Yeah,
People
a real rash
go to Cuba or whatever. Yeah,
that's exactly right. And entire airplanes then being diverted to either to Cuba or to places in the Middle East, and it was they were highly public, and the government really asserted itself here. Another thing that you can see on the sign here in the foreground is that ticketed passengers were only the ones allowed to the gate. I am old enough to remember going to airports in the early 1970s when you could go to the gate and greet people as they disembarked from the plane in the years before these mandates were put into place. Obviously, the United States would get even more serious about these kinds of searches in the wake of September 11th. But I think it's worth noting that the U.S. Early on was paying attention to this, and there was some grumbling. If you read the accounts of this, there was some grumbling because people saw it as a kind of inconvenience, and people also saw it as intrusive.
Sure.
But there you have it. The United States sort of pushing back against skyjackings in early 1973. Well, the Constitution mandates then after an election in January, used to be March or April, but in January then the swearing in ceremony would take place.
Well, wait a second. Just one moment.
Yes.
The inauguration was arguably the second most important thing that happened in January 1973.
Well,
the first,
do tell.
The first was a week before that, and that was the Super Bowl.
Fair enough.
Where the undefeated Miami Dolphins took on the Washington Redskins and won, becoming the first and only NFL team to ever have a perfect season record.
That's right. So yeah, so it was still a 14-game season, but the Dolphins really waltzed through the regular season. That no team in the AFC really was even close to the Dolphins. And then they pummeled their playoff opponents. Although the Super Bowl was, it was surprisingly close. The score was 14-7. Dolphins came out on top. It was marked by one of the most bizarre plays in Super Bowl history, where the Dolphins are kicking a field goal. Garo Yepremian, son of a Cypriot tie maker, that was always his moniker, tried the field goal. It was blocked. fell into the hands of Redskin defensive back Mike Bass, who ran it back for a touchdown. And the game had been completely dominated by the Dolphins, but suddenly the score was only a 7-point lead, and that's in fact how it would stay. And the Dolphins then completed their magic season.
But you're right. I think that was the closest game of their entire season.
I think that's right.
I remember watching that Dolphin team throughout that season.
Right.
And it was just mind-blowing how dominant they were.
Certainly were.
There was nothing, they were unstoppable. I mean, there was no, if you were a defense coordinator, there was no, in your dreams, you were not going to stop the Dolphins.
No, that's right.
Just try to slow them down enough that maybe your offense could score more than they did. But they had a running game with Zonka and Mercury Morris. I rarely saw those guys running plays that got less than 5 yards. It was like,
oh, that's right. No, it was astounding. They were sort of the quintessential kind of power football team, who, again, like you're saying, kind of a defensive coordinator's nightmare. And on occasion, then they would pass and set up, a play action pass to devastating results. They really were. I mean, and their defense was terrific. Their special teams were terrific, all of that. And they were just sort of the perfect team in many ways, led by, of course, Don Shula, who was a relatively new coach to the Dolphins. He had previously coached the Baltimore Colts. In fact, he had, so he had actually was the coach of the
also very successful at the Colts, right?
Very successful as the Colts, and I think it is, yes. So Shula has the most wins of any NFL coach, and so
you had Greasy at quarterback.
Yeah.
And people like Paul Warfield, one of the ends.
That's right.
The no-name defense, which was also astounding. The Dolphins went. They led the league in total offense, total defense, scoring offense, and scoring defense. And they're the only team to ever do that as well. So. They were just incredible to watch. Incredible.
It's kind of mind-boggling in a way to think about their level of dominance. We had not seen a team like that prior to the 72 season, and it seemed as though they were poised for kind of long-term success. That's not really how it works in football, right? And so they eventually were sort of cut down to size the next season. But
there have been dominant teams throughout NFL history, and usually you have a team that dominates like the Dolphins did, and they're going to be dominant for several seasons. I can think of a time when the Cowboys were just always winning, or the San Francisco 49ers, things like that. Are just sick of seeing them, or the freaking Patriots. So when a team is that dominant, they tend to really be on top for several years, and that didn't happen.
Oftentimes, just didn't happen. Yeah, it's the Dolphins remain, as you said, to open this, the only team to complete both a regular season and a postseason undefeated. The Patriots, New England Patriots, did complete an undefeated regular season, but they weren't able to seal the deal.
And the Bears, I think the Bears did too, at one point.
So it's, but it was kind of a magical run. And it is the case that there are still a handful of Dolphin players who are alive today, and they will reportedly open a bottle of champagne every season when the last undefeated team loses. This is an ongoing tradition that I think annoys a number of people, but they've been doing this for a long time. So those Dolphins that are left still enjoy a little bubbly.
Hey, you deserved it. I mean, that's really an incredible accomplishment. And the 1972 Dolphins were ranked #1 by the NFL on its 100th anniversary.
Yes.
The number
I
one
mean,
greatest team of all time.
I
So
mean, it's, I- yeah, I mean, I just, you have to, right? On some level, I mean, it's maybe a little apples and oranges from one era to the next, but that level of dominance, we've just not seen it before. So, I mean, you have to put them at the top. So, one of the interesting things about this is that maybe the Redskins' biggest fan was Richard Nixon.
yeah.
So the 20th of January, also a day where you have another event, and so you have here the swearing in of Nixon and Agnew on the outside the Capitol. And Nixon is a huge football fan. You want to talk a little bit about Hunter S. Thompson, who didn't have much good to say about Nixon, but
Oh,
they did
Thompson
find some.
absolutely despised Nixon, but I guess he found himself in the car hitching a ride with Nixon somehow, and they talked football,
Yeah.
and he really enjoyed that because he said the guy really knew his stuff. I mean, so on that
Yeah.
level, they could relate incredibly well.
Well,
And
there
he
we go.
was a very knowledgeable football fan and a big Redskins fan. And that
Huge Redskin. That's right.
that
And that was,
the Miami Dolphins were not invited as an undefeated team. They were not invited to the White House.
this is quite astounding. I mean, if you think about it. And
It
and
wasn't
and
wasn't really a thing back then that you would invite that the president would invite the Super Bowl
nevertheless,
team,
right,
but
is
um, several people think that there was some malice involved. Obama ended up inviting them 40 years later, and
they,
a number of
well,
them came.
there we go. It's I mean, it's so unlike Nixon to hold a grudge.
Oh
But
yeah, really.
there's a guy just like let things go. But so it's so odd to think about the inauguration and that people knew about Watergate. Watergate was a topic of conversation, but people had not yet heard about the tapes. And Agnew was still a kind of viable political figure, but it would be just roughly 9 months from this point where Agnew would resign in disgrace. It's just odd to think about the inaugural stand in '73. And then I think most people believed that both Nixon and Agnew would serve out the remainder of this term, and that people were talking about a Nixon second term, and Nixon was certainly talking about a Nixon second term,
Well,
and
Nixon had a
none of that would
mandate
happen.
like we hadn't seen at least since Johnson's
Well,
first term.
that is 100% true.
Incredible, right? I mean, just he could pretty much do what he wanted to do. The American people had spoken and said, "He's our man."
That's exactly right. And so he seemed, um, he seemed a dominant political figure. And I think people were thinking in terms of a kind of Nixon era. And I'm sure Nixon was thinking about how history would remember Nixon, and history would remember Nixon, but not really in the way that he had hoped. But it's just so odd that '73 is such a tumultuous year. But in early '73, it just looked as though Nixon was going to be able to, whatever Watergate was, was going to be able to put it behind him. And that this was all going to, that was all going to kind of roll into a second term. And, he was going to accomplish these incredible things, his supporters hoped. And none of that came to pass. It's just
And
weird.
well, as we go on to talk about the year as it unfolds, we'll get some idea for why it happened as it did.
So to mention here briefly, just a couple days after the inauguration, LBJ dies at his ranch in Texas. He died on the 22nd. And as you and I have, I mean, we've alluded to this in previous episodes. I mean, we see, I think LBJ is one of the real tragic figures in American political history, and someone I think, I believe, was really poised for incredible things, but was just
Well, I think,
consumed
yeah, I
by the
think we would
Vietnam
agree
War.
that he could have gone down in history as one of the really great presidents. If you take Vietnam out of his
Yeah,
portfolio.
that's right. And so Nick, LBJ passes away then on the 22nd. Okay, so the Nixon administration had been negotiating with North Vietnam for, well, for a year and a half or so in Paris and in other places. But on the 27th,
Before we talk about 27th,
oh, yeah, let's go. Let's do it.
January 22nd, Roe versus Wade was decided.
Oh, goodness. All right.
All right. And
Yeah, you're right.
clearly that was going to be something that would influence American politics for, well, it continues to. I mean,
Yeah.
you know,
It's
but
arguably, yeah, it's been the most important issue in American life for 50 years.
Republicans have run on this, and it's been a very effective issue for them.
Well,
It's a real wedge issue, but pro-life, and that started in January 22nd, 1973, with Roe versus Wade.
yeah, it's hard to imagine another decision in the late 20th century that had, well, it just transformed America. And as you're suggesting, it transformed domestic politics. It really reconstituted the Republican Party. Republicans more or less kind of coalesced around this issue, and it gave then conservative religious leaders a reason to become more political. And we'll talk about this in future episodes, but it's Roe v. Wade that really gives birth to the moral majority and Jerry Falwell.
And that's a huge development.
Oh, it's a huge development.
You can't even begin to say how incredibly important that development is, that you get the conservative religious, the religious right into politics, which they had really not been.
That's exactly, no, they had not been. Right. That's exactly right.
So
it changed everything. I mean, it changed everything. And obviously it afforded women then the opportunity to have control over their bodies in this regard. And this would remain in place until, well, relatively recently, when the Supreme Court then gutted Roe and then put the issue of abortion to individual states. That's pretty rare. That's pretty rare that the Supreme Court tramples on legal precedent. It's happened a handful of times in Supreme Court history, but we had it happen again a couple of years ago. Yeah, Roe v. Wade is, I mean, it's one of the most pivotal issues. I mean, arguably, it's one of the most pivotal issues of all time. No doubt about it. It changed America.
All right. So January 22nd, Johnson dies.
Yeah.
Roe versus Wade is decided. And George Foreman wins the World Heavyweight Championship by defeating Joe Frazier.
You know,
with a technical knockout. In the second round, Kingston, Jamaica.
You know, Foreman is he's such an interesting figure, right? He was a hero at the '68 Olympics, won the gold medal. He also then, so he beats Frazier, is heavyweight champion for a relatively short amount of time, and then kind of reemerges almost 20 years later as a heavyweight champion again. He becomes, I believe, the oldest heavyweight champion of all time when he, as a middle-aged man, he reasserts himself. He's really, and well, it's kind of an affable figure as well. So,
well, my question is this: where was Muhammad Ali in this time?
I assume that Ali was still serving his. It's not a suspension, but he had been
essentially a suspension, right? I mean, what do you call it?
Well, his belt had been stripped. His belts had been stripped from him by the boxing federations, at least 2 boxing federations, and he was sort of in. I mean, he was on the. He hadn't. I don't know, when did he start fighting again? Was that in '74?
It was shortly after that. It was shortly after that. Yeah.
So yeah, and again, this happens as Ollie's in his late 20s at the peak of his athletic
Peak of his career. Yeah.
yeah, and again, based upon his unwillingness to fight in Vietnam, and and also his outspokenness in terms of condemning the war. I mean, those two things together put a target on his back. It's really kind of astounding if you think about it, that um, political speech political speech is what that was his great crime. I mean, that was the issue. And wow, it's a different world in a way. I guess I should
Well, in
ask
a
Colin
way,
Kaepernick.
in a way it is. In a way it's not. Exactly.
Yeah.
No.
A big day. Yeah, for sure. A big day. So if we could to get to the 27th then of January, and the 27th of January marks the public end of the American involvement in Vietnam, as the United States and North Vietnam signed the Paris Peace Accord, which will then put into motion the American full and complete withdrawal from Vietnam. It'll take a fair amount of time for that to happen, but essentially this marks the end of the end of the American involvement in the war. This, of course, doesn't end the war. South Vietnam wasn't real thrilled about this. I think many people in South Vietnam, and certainly observers, saw this as sort of a death sentence for South Vietnam.
Well, it was.
But and it was. But it also cements the notion that Nixon was a leader with a great flair, great acumen for international issues. That Nixon basically guaranteed a kind of end to American involvement, and I mean he delivers. And so it's
again, if you were a young anti-Vietnam protester, you would not have voted for Nixon. But
that's right.
No one would have gotten out. No one you could have voted for.
I think
would have gotten us out of Vietnam quicker than Nixon did.
I think that's fair. I think that's absolutely fair. It's also interesting in this. It's maybe a little difficult to see here, but one of the images is of the American Secretary of State, William Rogers, signing the deal. William Rogers didn't have anything to do with the negotiations. In fact, he was frozen out because Nixon had Kissinger, who was at this point an advisor, handle almost all of the negotiations. In fact, Rogers was left in the dark about most of this. And eventually Rogers got so fed up with all of this that he would resign later this year. But you do see Rogers inking the agreement. And so, I mean, say what you will, right? We'll say some pretty harsh things about Nixon over the next few minutes. He was gifted. And when it came to international affairs, he had the patience, he had the foresight. He got a lot of things done. He did things that were really unimaginable on the international level, and we'll talk about a couple of them today. But so he had his flaws. There were a lot of flaws.
Well, and I think most of them are under the category of personal demons, right?
I think that's fair. I think that's absolutely right. So. So anything else did anything else go down in January of 73 of note?
Well, I think you can talk about the fact that on January 30th, on the 27th, when the accords were signed, on that day the U.S. military draft was abolished, which it kind of makes sense, but a lot of times you don't have that sort of thing. That's the sort of thing that a lot of politicians kind of like to have in their back pocket.
Well, that's right.
And just, but no, we're done. The draft is over.
We're done.
Period.
And the United States has never gone back to it. I mean, I think it's so interesting.
Yeah, okay.
Talk to young
never
people
went back
today,
to the draft, but did reinstate the selective service under Jimmy Carter.
Well,
which I consider to be a personal betrayal.
Okay. Well, I understand. And so that selective service exists. And again, young people in the United States, when they turn 18, they do submit their contact information to Selective Service in order to get access to any kind of federal aid and that kind of thing. But the draft, we've never gone back to conscription. The United States has never gone back to conscription. And given what we understand about how the war went for the United States, it seems, and the lack of discipline, and I mean, it was, you had a lot of problems in Vietnam with soldiers American soldiers simply didn't want to be there. A lot of problems. And I just think it's unlikely that the United States would go down that road again. I mean, you never know.
Vietnam was a clusterfuck. And the draft was one of many parts of that. What sort of people were we drafting? Well, that was also part of the problem with McNamara and his what did they call that program? Where they were drafting kids that
people who were developmentally disabled.
Yes. And doing that
roughly 100,000.
It was a conscious decision, right? To provide more cannon fodder with that sort of
that's right. It's also the case, right, that the educational deferments existed in the United States in the 60s and into the early 70s that allowed then, generally speaking, kind of more middle class, more affluent Americans to avoid the draft by ensconcing themselves not only in as an undergraduate but also in graduate schools, right? And so if you were in college, you were able to stay out of the draft. And so
and that means that the racial mix wasn't fair either. So the whole.
I think there was a dramatic rethink. I mean, Vietnam was a disaster on many levels, but I think there was such a dramatic rethink regarding conscription. I just think it's unlikely that the United States revisits anytime soon. And so I think, but to your point, Dave, no young person is going to vote for Nixon yet. Who ends the war? Nixon. Who ends the draft? Nixon. And a lot of other things that Nixon did that touched the lives of young people. He's a mass of contradictions.
Yes,
it
really is.
Unbelievable.
Two other things went on in January.
Yeah, go ahead. January.
J. Gordon Liddy was found guilty of charges involving Watergate.
Oh God. Yeah.
January 30th. January 31st, Pan Am and Trans World Airlines canceled their options to buy 13 Concorde airliners. So
yeah,
that seems strange to me, because I would have thought if I had been a decision maker back then, this is the wave of the future. I would just I think that's where you want to go. Paris to New York in what, like 3 hours or something?
Something like that, yeah.
It's outrageously short.
Throughout the 60s, the SST, the supersonic transport program, was held as the kind of future of aviation. And as it became a reality, it was expensive. The planes were expensive. The planes were very, very fuel efficient, and they were incredibly loud. And so in American cities, many cities banned their landing. They simply just wouldn't allow them to access their airports. And so, yeah, you would think, right, that airlines would just jump at the chance, but really, it just never happened. I mean, the Concorde existed. It would be in kind of a dual program between the French and the British, and Air France and British Airways, right? They had a handful of planes, but it just never really. No
American airline possessed an SST.
That's right.
Right?
That's right.
Yeah.
That's right. It's just, and particularly given America's interest, passion about all things fast and, kind of space travel and sort of the future of transport, the fact that American airlines just sort of turned their back on the program is just kind of jaw-dropping. I mean, I understand there are the economic considerations, but it was going to be the future, and it just didn't amount to it amounted to
Well,
nothing.
there's also almost something adventurous about it, right?
Agreed. I mean,
You
I
go
agree.
travel, and you're going to be flying twice as fast as Chuck Yeager ever did. What the
I
what?
know it's kind of mind-boggling, right? It's kind of
Yeah,
mind-boggling, but it never really. I mean, it was just a kind of niche, and it never really took off, so to speak. It's surprising. I mean, looking back on it, I mean, again, in the '60s, you would have bet everything that the SST would have been. This is the
yeah.
future, and it just amounted to zilch.
Would have been one of my many wrong calls about
Oh, me too. I would have bet. Yeah, me
yeah.
too. Me too. All right. Is that so? January.
Let's
What
talk a little
about
bit
in
about what
what
was
about
going on in
music?
music in January, right?
Yeah, let's do it.
January 5th, Aerosmith came out with its debut studio album. Um, didn't make a big splash.
No.
Clive Davis was a fan of Aerosmith, and which helps. Um, but their their hit "Dream On" um, became a hit when it was released as a single, rather when it was re-released.
Yeah, there was this re-release thing. That's right.
Right, 1975.
That's it.
And that's when the album and the single both did quite well. The single went top 10, and the album peaked at number 21. But
Mhm.
that was their debut album, January 5th. Also January 5th, another debut album. Singer-songwriter Bruce Springsteen,
No, I've
also
heard
on
of him.
Columbia Records. Greetings from Asbury Park, New Jersey, right?
Yeah, this is the new Bob Dylan, so they
The
say.
new Bob Dylan, exactly. And that's kind of what you listen to the lyrics of these, and he was trying real hard to be Dylan-esque.
What? Yeah, I mean, wasn't it the case that the John Hammond was working with him? It was the same person who worked with Dylan. I mean, there was a lot to sort of was pushing him in that direction. It was, I mean, to be fair to Springsteen, you certainly had people at the label who that's how they perceived him.
2013, Rolling Stone listed Greetings from Asbury Park, New Jersey as one of the 100 greatest debut albums of all time. I'm not a huge
Sure.
fan. I'm not a huge fan of the album, but I think you probably have to go there, right?
Yeah, I'd agree. Right.
The Sweet released Blockbuster.
You Blockbuster.
Yeah, that was their only number one hit in the UK. That was on the 13th. Stayed on the top of the charts for 5 weeks. It was one of the first glam hits of the decade. And they followed that up with three straight number two singles: Hellraiser, The Ballroom Blitz, and Teenage Rampage.
You have a soft spot for the Sweet.
I
You
do.
just you
It's a
just
sweet
do.
spot.
But you have a sweet spot. There we go. But they made good records. They made
Oh
good
yeah.
records. Yeah, no doubt about that.
On the 14th, Elvis
Mhm.
Presley went to Hawaii
Oh yes.
for a worldwide telecast.
Oh, yes, I still remember this broadcast.
Was watched by more people than the Apollo moon landings. And that's although it wasn't
Oh,
shown in the Eastern Bloc, of course, because communist censorship. East Germany, they could get it on the Schwarze Kanal.
the Schwarzer Kanal.
So, but two other countries did not air it until April. Do you know what they were? What countries those were?
Probably the stinking Canadians.
Oh, it's a good guess, but
No, I don't know. I don't have any idea. No.
we're talking about Brazil and the United States.
Okay. Yes.
Americans could not watch it. They had to wait until April.
I remember. Okay, so this was a big deal. This must have been a Colonel Tom Parker deal, but
It was a huge
um,
deal. Yeah.
it was a huge deal. Um, my parents actually didn't own very many albums, but they bought this album live via Aloha via satellite from Hawaii. And I remember the show. I remember that because it was I was on NBC, and it was sponsored by Singer Sewing Machines. No, that's a hip sponsor. But yeah, it,
But
nobody
in the United States, you could buy the album before you could watch it.
that's just I don't that's so well that's a Colonel Tom Parker thing. It's got to be. It's so strange. Nobody believes that more people saw that than I mean, I remember that. There's no way that could be the case. More people saw it than the moon landing.
It doesn't seem like it.
No, it doesn't.
All right, and I'll admit I have not vetted this, but
Oh, I've read this too. I mean, this is the lore that surrounds it. There's no way that's true. I mean, because the source has got to be, it's got to be Elvis's camp, the Memphis Mafia. It's fair to say that Elvis had, I mean, his peak had, was in the rearview mirror. He had not fallen off the cliff like he did in a couple of years.
Right.
It's a good show. He puts on a good show. And it's quite, he's in his Las Vegas glory there, the jumpsuit.
He has a freaking catalog that's just unreal, so
he does yeah, I mean it's a great show. It's very Elvis, but it's a great show. And the people just ate him up. I mean, what's not the love? Yeah, Elvis in his jumpsuit and his towels and his scarves but you had to wait to see it. Sponsored by
if you were in America, you did.
Yeah, yep. I remember this was a huge television event, live via satellite, except it wasn't live. But details.
I think there's probably a reason for being skeptical about the Apollo Moon thing.
Well, I don't mean to. Yeah, listen, I don't mean to disparage. There's just no way that's true.
Moving on.
25th
of January, Dixie Chicken came out. Third studio album of Little Feat.
Little Feat, Lowell George's Little Feat, Dixie Chicken. That's a fine song. It's a really good album. I remember checking this album out at the public library where I grew up. Yeah, Lowell George, that Little Feat always kind of bubbled just beneath the surface in the United States. Lowell George
would great album covers.
Did have great album covers, and that music, it was really good. That's a really good band. But yeah, Dixie Chicken.
26th, day later. Don't Shoot Me, I'm Only the Piano Player.
Well,
Elton John's 6th studio album.
Is there a song on that other than Daniel that's memorable?
Crocodile Rock yielded John his first #1 single, both the US and Canada.
There we go. It's that album it's okay. It's certainly not what the next one would be, Yellow Brick Road, but I mean he's riding high. I mean, this era is peak Elton John.
Well, and Yellow Brick Road came out in '73 too. So that's right. He's just prolific as hell at this time.
That's right. Yeah. Thank you, Mr. Toppin, by the way.
Oh yes. Last but not least, on the 30th, Kiss performs their first concert.
This is
in Cleveland.
Yeah. Reportedly to just a handful of people, 6 people or something like that, right? It's just
no one knew that. And I remember my first impression of Kiss was that it was just a group of Alice Cooper plagiarizers.
My
first impression.
Right. I
13 years old.
I had a friend growing up who was an enormous Kiss fan, early member of the Kiss Army and all that. They certainly had enthusiasm, and those well, I mean, it'll be a few years before we get to Destroyer. Yeah. But Destroyer's that's a really good album.
Well, it's really, I think it was hard for anyone in our generation not to become a Kiss fan at some point.
I think that's right.
Because they were just such a strong band.
But to your point though about the Alice Cooper, I mean, there was something derivative about their approach to makeup and whatnot, whether they were, stealing it from the New York Dolls or again from Alice Cooper. But
they were all in. I mean,
but they were all in. I mean, that's
they really sold it, and they went all the way. So
And they are also on the cusp of ending their tenure as a touring act. At least Paul Stanley and Gene Simmons, the two remaining members, original members. So, yeah, good things must come to an end, I guess.
Well, unless you count the avatars, they'll just get some avatars up there.
Well, and they're open to that apparently. So there we go. So Kiss, the origin of Kiss, January of '73.
Yes.
Let's jump to February if we could, '73, and on the 7th of February, the Senate decides to get a little more serious about this Watergate business, and votes to establish a Senate Select Committee, a bipartisan committee, to investigate Watergate. They'll start meeting in April. They agree that Sam Ervin, a Democrat from North Carolina, will chair. The ranking Republican will be a guy by the name of Howard Baker from Tennessee. And almost everybody on that committee will become almost rock star famous because the hearings were televised. And Americans followed them very closely. And my God, the things that we learned through the Senate Watergate Committee, it's just really quite astounding.
I think the January 6th committee gives us a feel for what that was, a bit of a feel for what that was like.
A bit of a feel. I agree. A bit of a feel. But
I don't think it had quite the same impact, but
it didn't have quite the same impact, but I think you're right, though. It definitely puts us in the neighborhood of that. But I think it gives us a sense, because there was plenty of pressure in Washington to just ignore the Watergate piece. That's certainly what the Nixon administration would have desired. But the Senate was under some heat to kind of figure out what the heck was going on. And I think it gives a real sense to how the temperature is rising when it comes to all of this. And it will get to a boil in midsummer without question. On the 12th,
the thing about it was just so strange. Every little bit of news that came out was just so bizarre. It's like, what?
Yeah.
And these guys get caught, and we find out that one of them was a CIA guy, and it just went from there. Just one strange revelation after another.
That's right. That every person that they brought to testify had something meaningful, something surprising, something jaw-dropping to add. And so it never stopped. The public, the interest never stopped. In fact, anything, it increased as the hearings rolled on. And it was clear that
the first information was even during the 1972 campaign, right? I mean, that the first bits that were coming out.
Sure, right.
And nobody was concerned about that. Obviously, nobody was concerned about that. Everybody voted for Nixon anyway.
Obviously, no one was concerned.
So
yeah, I mean, again, the point you raised about the inauguration. I mean, he seemed an indestructible figure politically. I mean, nobody has that kind of mandate going into office, but it all comes apart in '73, and this is a big moment. And if you were Nixon, you had to be worried when you understood that the Senate was going to start to investigate. On the 12th of February, Nixon also delivers on a campaign promise. That promise was to start bringing home the POWs from Vietnam. The prisoner of war issue in Vietnam became very public as the war was so contentious that a kind of common ground was found by Americans on both sides of the issue through a support of the POWs. And I remember this quite distinctly, that there are these bracelets.
POW bracelets, yeah.
POW bracelets with the name of a POW.
And the idea was you would buy a bracelet. It would have a unique. This would be your POW that you support.
That's exactly.
You would wear that until that person got released.
Yeah,
and your vow.
That's right. And so people paid attention. So I remember. Kids wore these bracelets.
Yeah.
And this all started to well, come to a head then on the 12th with Operation Homecoming. There would be several planes full of POWs making their way then to the United States, and images of POWs exiting the plane and families, running across the tarmac and stuff. It was, people were very excited about it, and news outlets in the United States covered this. I mean, really wall to wall, and so they would break in with live coverage of when these planes would land, and it was. I think that the war was, so traumatic for so many people that it was just. I mean, people were relieved to have a little bit of good news, I guess. And this, I think, in the minds of most people, was a little bit of good news with these POWs coming home, including several famous POWs, including one John McCain, who, of course, would become a very important political figure in the United States. This was a big deal.
Do you happen to have that picture? That's a Pulitzer Prize.
I don't have it. I know what you're talking about.
Photographer. It's called "Burst of Joy."
Burst of Joy, yeah.
And it really is quite a memorable image. Let's just pull that up for a second. So,
yeah,
there we have it. And clearly, this is a fairly large family and a lot of kids, and they're all glad to see their dad. There's the mom in the background. They're all running, and it's been probably at least a year since they've seen him.
Oh, yeah, it's been probably much longer than that, but yeah.
So as a POW, right? Not just
it's
a normal soldier. So
yeah, so I mean, these kinds of reunions, just one after the next, and so it was. I think there was a collective sigh of relief amongst many Americans that the peace treaty had been signed and that the prisoners of war were coming home. Now, again, the POW issue in the United States would remain volatile, and actually, there still are Americans who believe that not all the prisoners of war came home. The so-called POW/MIA issue in the United States remained really a potent one. My community here in Kansas still flies, the city government still flies a POW/MIA flag.
Wow.
It's so it's there's a lot there. There's a lot there to unpack. But that war in '73, the war in the minds of most Americans had come to an end. Now, it won't completely come to an end until the spring of '75, and it comes to a very messy, bloody end, very complicated end. But I think for most people, Americans that began to tune out the Vietnam War after early 1973, because a number of the big questions in their mind had been answered. And people, didn't probably want to think too much about the consequences of the war. They were just ready to leave it behind them.
Oh, definitely, because none of the answers that were available or that we could have gotten were feel good answers. I mean, it was all just a mess, right?
It's all such a mess, and it's it's certainly, I think, our contention that the United States has never really fully dealt with the issues that Vietnam raised, and that there's the specter of Vietnam, I think, still haunts the United States. It still influences foreign policy. It still influences military policy. It is. It ended for Americans in '73. I guess formal end. Last Americans came out in '75, but in a way, it's never really ended because it's still there. It's just, it just changed the way America fought wars and thought about itself on the international stage. So mid-month, 16th of February, I would argue the most consequential political organization of the last, again, 50 years was formed, and that was the Heritage Foundation. Heritage Foundation, Paul Weyrich, Edwin Feuler, and one Joseph Coors, the brewing magnate, joined forces in the immediate wake of Roe v. Wade to create a political organization that would espouse more conservative cultural and political values. The Heritage Foundation think tank, and the Heritage Foundation then would go on then to create really a kind of impetus to on the federal judiciary to bring in more conservative judges, create a whole phalanx of lawyers. It had fairly kind of, it started small, but it became big pretty quickly. And it certainly transformed, helped to transform the Republican Party. I mean, it's hard to argue that, I mean, what's been more influential in American politics? I mean, few organizations have been more influential in American politics in the past few decades than the Heritage Foundation. I mean, the proof's in the pudding, right? You can look at the contemporary Supreme Court in the United States in 2023. That is a direct outgrowth of Heritage Foundation activities. I mean, it goes on and on.
Well, the question is, does the left have anything nearly equivalent to that? And if not,
the answer is no.
Okay. If not, why not? Because it's clearly been very effective. So what the hell?
It's one of the great mysteries in American politics over the past few decades, is why the left has been unable to respond in kind in terms of a kind of counter to the Heritage Foundation. The left has just simply been, grasping at straws, while the Heritage Foundation has just transformed the American judiciary. It's transformed electoral politics, pushing things like the Citizens United ruling. It's just been enormously successful. You don't have Ronald Reagan, right, without the Heritage Foundation. You don't have Roe v. Wade being overturned without the Heritage Foundation. On and on and on and on it goes. So incredibly, incredibly influential. A couple other things from February, if we could. On the 22nd of February, based upon Nixon's visit to China, the United States and China start formal diplomatic relations, something that had been decades in the offing. There was a country that was really concerned about this, and that country, of course, was Taiwan. The United States had long recognized Taiwan as, if you will, China. And Taiwan was not particularly thrilled at then Peking and Washington having diplomatic relations. The United States, the relationship between the United States and China remains complicated, but this is another Nixon success. This is one of the great achievements of the 20th century. This is one of the great diplomatic achievements of all time. And Nixon's responsible. Nixon and Kissinger are responsible for this. It's hard to argue against Nixon's influence. God Almighty, look at the first month and a half of 73.
Yeah.
It's just staggering. Then last thing that I want to mention here, on the 28th of February, in a very isolated part of South Dakota, the fledgling American Indian movement starts a rally and then has a takeover of a large portion of the Wounded Knee reservation in southern South Dakota. And this will be an ongoing standoff with the federal government for several weeks. There will be violence. There will be deaths. There will be trials and incarcerations. You still have at least one member of the American Indian movement, Leonard Petier, in prison for this. But Wounded Knee is.
Wait, just a moment. His imprisonment and the charges against him were not directly involved with this Wounded Knee thing.
You're right. That's right.
But yes, he is
it's
an Indian activist, activist. Is still in prison. So yeah.
The Wounded Knee site is symbolic. This is in the late 19th century. The site of the so-called Wounded Knee massacre. Natives here had been on a reservation for several years. They were part of the Ghost Dance movement, which was a movement of
essentially the last armed resistance of
this is the last armed resistance of the so-called Indian Wars, right? The U.S. military encircled the natives as they participated in this Ghost Dance, and then unleashed their fury, including with two kind of primitive machine guns.
Gatling guns. Yeah.
The Gatling guns. The commander of the troops ordered the wounded to remain untouched for 3 days so that they would freeze to death. And then the the dead were then unceremoniously scooped up and dumped into a pit at Wounded Knee. More American soldiers were awarded the Medal of Honor at Wounded Knee than in any other battle in American history. It's really quite staggering. And so this is a very, very evocative spot. And so it made perfect sense for the American Indian movement to make their stand here in the early 70s in South Dakota. It remains, and we're not breaking new ground here, it remains sort of baffling, the status of Native Americans in the United States. There's no segment of American population that's poorer than the Native Americans. Native American reservation land remains nightmarish. And quite frankly, Wounded Knee is still a very, very, very difficult place to live. And I wish there was an outcome here that was more positive, but the kinds of issues that activists were pointing out in '73 still exist amongst Native Americans today. If anything, the issues are more pressing. It's really quite grim. So what else happened in February, Dave?
February 29th, the day after that, Gravity's Rainbow by
oh my gosh,
came out. So
that's
a literary event.
Pynchon, right?
Yeah.
Thomas Pynchon.
Yeah. So and of course, as in every month, 1973, a lot was going on in music.
Yeah, what?
Well, Elvis came out with an album, a live album from Hawaii.
Well, I'll be darned.
Yeah, just literally like 2 weeks after the concert had taken place, they released this album. And it peaked at #1 on the Billboard chart. Americans wanted to hear what the rest of the world had already heard. And it was huge. It ended up being a 5-time platinum album. So for somebody
it's one of his
success, this was one of his most successful albums.
For sure. And I think there was still an appetite for Elvis. There was so much residual goodwill for Elvis. And, even the 60s were, Elvis made a lot of mistakes. Well, Tom Parker made a lot of mistakes, pushed Elvis into a lot of mistakes. But I think so many people in the American public had, they kind of always rooted for Elvis. And so given the opportunity, they're going to snap up an album. And this example of that for sure.
Sure. On the 2nd, the Midnight Special made its debut as a regular series on the U.S. television.
That's a good show.
Helen Reddy was the featured artist on their first show. On the 14th. Sorry, go.
No. That show would run into the early 80s. I remember that being not only an interesting show, but a kind of an important show, because this was still an era where you didn't see people perform. This is still obviously pre-internet and pre-cable television, pre-MTV, all of that. And so you had precious few chances to see your favorite performers, give a go. And the Midnight Special was, it was really well done. It was always an eclectic lineup. Every week you're never really sure what you're getting from week to week, but man, there was a lot of good stuff on there. A lot of good stuff.
February 14th, David Bowie collapsed from exhaustion after a performance at Madison Square Garden.
Exhaustion, you say?
Exhaustion, yeah. Whatever that means exactly. But.
So, this is help me. This is still Ziggy Stardust?
Yeah.
So it's definitely exhaustion then.
He will have a famous break with that persona a bit later in the year, but at
Yeah,
that point he's still.
it's Bowie. I think Bowie was still. I mean, the Ziggy Stardust persona um, will be kind of defining, kind of career defining, and maybe even career making. But I
Oh,
think he
career
was,
making, I think is in
yeah,
any case, yes.
and I think there still was a lot of mystery surrounding Bowie, and that people heard him, but they'd also heard about his stage shows. I mean, so Bowie will make an appearance on the Midnight Special later this year, which will also be significant. It's just again, it's an era where you would see things in newspapers, you would see things in magazines, you would hear people talk, you'd look at album covers, but there was just a lot of not knowing. And Bowie was one of those figures that I think was incredibly intriguing to a lot of people, but they wanted to know more, they wanted to learn more, they wanted to see him. There was a lot of kind of mystery that surrounded him and Ziggy's Stardust persona.
Yeah. Last thing in terms of music for February was that the King Biscuit Flower Hour was had its first broadcast with performances by Blood, Sweat, and Tears, the Mahavishnu Orchestra,
Mhm.
and Bruce Springsteen.
Yep.
So
That's
a
that
couple
was
important
a
pilots.
for sure. That was a show that was broadcast locally. Typically, it was broadcast late at night, but I remember listening to that, and this is where you would hear, um, you know, up and coming acts, sometimes avant garde acts in a live setting, and it was a real coup to be on the King Biscuit Flower Hour. So that explains, I think, in part why um, Springsteen was on it. I'm sure the label made an effort. Let's go to March,
Sure.
March '73, and we've been talking about the United States without talking about John Lennon, but we should probably talk about him because '73 is a big year. In that Lennon is in the midst of a kind of a crisis, a
Yes.
legal crisis involving his immigration status. Um, and on the 6th of March, his immigration status changes. The United States kind of reverses course regarding his immigration. He had recently, I think 5 days before, had been granted an extension, and then that extension had been revoked. And so this is the press conference Lennon and one Yoko Ono are making on the 6th, talking about the situation. Lennon's perspective, and I think probably pretty accurate, is that he was being singled out in large measure because of his political views, and that he was getting unique attention from the Nixon administration. And quite frankly, I think many people in the Nixon administration would just have soon seen John Lennon in Europe or anywhere else aside the United States.
Yeah.
Uh,
Yeah. I mean, it's no accident that this was became such a big thing.
that's exactly right. And it's I don't know how to categorize it today. I mean, how the fame, the import of someone like Lennon in this era. I mean, he has to be one of the most well-known figures on planet Earth. Um,
Well, I
his
think at that
immigration,
point he is bigger than Jesus Christ.
well, careful. Yeah, I know. God, I mean, that's one of those. If there's one of those things he could take back.
Yeah.
Um, but it's also the case that his situation became a kind of cause celeb across the United States, and so many people weighed in on
Oh yeah.
Lennon's immigration status, and he picked up friends in all sorts of interesting places.
Well,
And
to be clear, uh, thousands or tens of thousands of people have difficulty getting their green cards
yes, this is
every
a
year.
yeah, that's right.
But fame brings this privilege with it that your application for that sort of thing gets special treatment.
Yes, special treatment.
But depending on your fame, as we see here, uh, Well, it could be a two-edged sword. And
That's exactly right.
what we have in this case.
No doubt about it. Lennon will, boy, it's, he's such a difficult figure to kind of pin down. We're on the cusp of a kind of personal free fall from Lennon here coming up in a few months. And it is also the case that compared to some of the other members of the Beatles, Lennon's singles solo career is floundering a bit. But he was, I think, kind of a voice of a generation, certainly the face of a generation. And certainly unlike McCartney, Lennon had a kind of political import. And so when the Nixon administration was clearly kind of targeting Lennon, lots of people got upset. Jumping to the 23rd, if we could, to 23rd.
No, let's jump back for a second.
Let's don't jump to the 23rd. Let's jump back.
The first.
Well, let's do it.
Charlotte's Web comes out as an animated film.
Oh yeah.
And And I have to cry every time I see it.
It's it had kind of a second life as a film, right? This has been a beloved, this is E.B.Y's beloved children's classic, but the film is really well done.
Yes, it is well done, and it's a lot of fun to see, and probably at this point, more kids have seen the movie than have actually read the book.
Oh, I'm sure that's true. No, I'm sure that's true. But so often the case is that these film adaptations, these particularly animated, come up a little short. But this one is charming, and it really works. So that's okay. Anything else happened in? Go ahead.
Last episode of the original Laugh-In airs on NBC.
You think that Laugh-In's it would have gone longer. I mean, for some reason, Laugh-In has this. It seems to be sort of this indelible kind of moment in American kind of pop culture history, but its high water mark it's pretty short, right? It's just a handful of years.
Yeah. Well, it cultivates a certain sensibility that I think during its peak years worked very well.
Yeah. It needed though, but it needed things to push against, and I mean, a big part of, so you had the without Vietnam, I don't know that, I mean, Laugh-In's is going to run out of gas, and you can only do so many Nixon jokes, and that's pretty much what they had at this point. So Laugh-In. And whatever happened to Dan Roan and Dick Martin, right?
I don't know. They were both very good at what they did.
They were. That whole show was odd, if you think about it. Just the premise, it was very much of the moment, but it obviously launched a number of careers. Lily Tomlin, Goldie Hawn among many. Yes. But it had a certain, it was definitely of the moment.
On the 23rd, there's another little Watergate thing going on. In a letter to Judge Sirica, one of the burglars, James McCord Jr., admits that he and the other defendants had been pressured to remain silent about the case.
This is okay, right?
And he named former Attorney General John Mitchell as the overall boss.
That's quite a note. Yeah.
John Mitchell, that places someone in Nixon's immediate vicinity.
No, that's right.
In this. And so things are starting to heat up.
That's right. You don't get much closer to Nixon than John Mitchell. And so that's quite a note. It's clear, right? McCord could feel it. And the others there, they were being railroaded, right? That they were being forced to take the fall. And quite frankly, to his credit, because this is something Liddy wouldn't have done, but to his credit, he sort of lets Sirica and the world know, hey, wait a minute. Hey, wait a minute.
Oh yeah. I'm not going to be the stooge here, or if I am, at least I'm taking other people down with me, and that's
Right. And this gives us a quick chance then. I mean, I know this is something I haven't yet to see, but you've seen it, the recent plumbers.
the Watergate plumbers or the White House plumbers. I think something
This
like that.
what you think is terrific, right?
It's fantastic. Yeah.
Yeah.
So,
So that's the 23rd. On the 27th, near the end of the month, the Academy Awards take place, and Academy Awards always a star-studded event. And this year it was really a kind of celebration of The Godfather, right? The Godfather had been really
The Godfather and Cabaret.
Yes, in Cabaret.
Those
Well said. That's right. Yeah. Really dominated by those two films. I think the drill was pretty clear. I mean, so you'd have the nominees. They'd announce the winner. You'd walk up to stage and you do your spiel and you thank God and everybody else. Then and then the music would play and everybody sort of knew the drill. But when the best actor Oscar was announced, the script was flipped a bit. When Marlon Brando's name was announced, such a little feather
scans the crowd. Where is
he? Where is he? Where is he? And and he was easy to. He was hard to miss. Let's put it that way. But he wasn't there. But instead, a young Native American, Satchmo Littlefeather, comes to the podium. This is the picture of, and nobody knew this. So this is one of the things that's so interesting about this is that nobody. I guess I'm surprised in a way that nobody knew this. And if they did know, they certainly acted like they didn't know. This is the confusion on Roger Moore's face and Liv Ullmann, although she doesn't seem as confused as Moore, as Littlefeather is announcing what's actually going down here. This was, so she makes a short speech on behalf of Brando, decrying the treatment of Native Americans. And also then making an allusion into the Wounded Knee occupation, and this was seismic. So this was a seismic event in American cultural history, and because this is
you did not use the Oscars to make political statements.
That was it, right? It was the setting that was. It was not so much the speech, but it was the setting. And many people thought that the Oscars were somehow being defiled by this. Reportedly, again, people didn't know anything about this. And so reportedly, when people backstage heard about this, some people just got livid, including one John Wayne, who apparently had to be kind of physically restrained from going out and punching out. This one, I mean, who knows exactly, but the Duke was not happy amongst any others, and I'm not certain. And maybe you have a different thought about this. I'm not certain that this had the effect that Brando intended, because I don't know that the political import of this came across. I just think that people saw it as a kind of stunt, and I think Brando was wounded a bit in terms of his reputation, personal reputation, and I don't think that the point was really made.
Well,
but maybe I'm misreading that.
Even before this, he had a reputation for being an extremely difficult person to work
with.
And,
I think that's right.
Coppola had to basically beg the studio to allow him to get him into The Godfather.
That's right.
That's then follows up with it. It's amazing that he had a career in his later years.
Wow.
But it was just kind of I don't think he cared. I don't think he cared about this.
I don't think he cared either. And I think in part, I think that's absolutely right. I think in part because he had a long-standing kind of connection to civil rights issues. He was a serious person. He attended the March on Washington. He attended King's funeral. mean, he marched, he protested, he made his voice heard, and he wrote checks. I mean, he was a substantial person. Yeah, he was difficult, no question about that. But I think this changed. I think it opened the door for other winners to use then events like this as a kind of political platform. I mean, up to this point, this has not been done. And today it's almost kind of de rigueur. I mean, this is the kind of thing that you're going to watch an award show, you're going to hear, 2 or 3 political speeches, this kind of thing. It happens all the time now. This is the first. And it really set shockwaves, not just across Hollywood, but across the United States. I remember this being a national story for several days.
Didn't Liv Ullmann also have a moment like that? No, who am I thinking of?
Well, I'm not certain.
Because there was another.
Vanessa Redgrave.
Vanessa Redgrave she was accepting the Best Actress for.
It might have been. Yeah, we should probably nail this down lest we make a mistake here. But Vanessa Redgrave used the Oscars in a similar kind of manner. It was a similar kind of manner, a very different kind of political talking point. But Brando was the first.
Well, I think it even was something with Palestinians or something.
It was. Yeah, it was. Yeah, for sure. Yeah. So what about music in March? Anything happening?
Well, back to the Oscar for just a second.
Yeah, sure.
Because I'm a huge cabaret fan. And I think that Bob Fosse won Best Director there. I think that was very justified. So those two movies, Cabaret and Godfather, were really incredibly important.
All right, but you're suggesting that Bob Fosse is a justified win over?
Yeah.
Really?
Yes.
Wow.
Well, I'm not sure The Godfather is a justified win over Cabaret for Best Picture.
Oh, well, come on. Really?
Yeah.
I mean, I know you're a fan, but come on. Well, okay. Well, there we go.
Well,
more Cabaret, please.
But I'm probably splitting hairs there because clearly Godfather is an excellent movie. But
there you go. Yeah, it's pretty good. The Godfather. Yeah. But it's no Cabaret, apparently.
It's no Cabaret,
It's astounding. But anyway, good for you. All right.
Let's take a little bit of a look at the music of
Let's
March.
Do.
Little known album by the name of The Dark Side of the Moon came out on March 1st. And this is something that I think at the time was pretty much under the radar.
Well, it was, right? Pink Floyd is because Pink Floyd wasn't Pink Floyd yet.
Right. And Dark Side of the Moon wasn't Dark Side of the Moon yet. So
you're exactly right. And so what had Pink Floyd done before Dark Side of the Moon to really grab? I mean, they'd already had a fairly lengthy career. They'd had some hits. They'd had a lot of misses. Not that many hits. I mean, it's just Dark Side of the Moon.
Atomic Heart, Mother.
Yes, I mean, right. You have
probably as much as anything else.
Obscured by Clouds. I mean, you've got some things there that are. Yeah, they certainly had a following. But it's a Dark Side, right? That transform it. Not only it transforms Pink Floyd, it also I think kind of helps to kind of elevate the album,
right? Because
into a kind of art form.
Exactly. Yeah. And this is the first of a series of really, really important albums that they put out.
No question. They had the great run during the 70s.
Yeah,
that's right. Yeah, but it's the first of these, and so you're right. It gets released, and It's got this kind of exotic kind of, I mean, it's hard to even capture what's going on with the cover from Hypnosis, but it's, there's a lot there. And then to listen to it, it's an incredible achievement. I mean, again, right? Alan Parsons is part of the recording, and they have really incredible talent helping to engineer it. But the group is also fully functional, right? It's a collective. They're taking input from everybody, and they're willing to experiment and try some things. And the dictatorial nature of Roger Waters is not really completely,
full blown. Yeah.
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 It's, they had used that, the music for that had been written a year or so in advance, and in fact they had been touring.
They've been touring with it, yes. Touring and performing this music before they ever recorded it, even.
That's right, for a year. They even, I was looked this up fairly recently. They even came to Wichita, Kansas, and played music from Dark Side at then Henry Levitt Arena. Again, this is almost a year, or I think maybe 6 months before the album was released. It's just kind of like, what? But right, this is the album that makes Pink Floyd. But I think more importantly, this is one of the albums that makes the album then sort of the thing of the 70s, and that the album becomes a kind of art form, recording using the studio. Many groups have done this already, but the use of the studio as a kind of instrument comes full flower here. It's a monumental achievement.
Well, this would, of course, break all the records on the Billboard charts.
That's right.
It would go 14 times platinum. Just incredible. Over 45 million copies sold worldwide, making it the 4th best-selling album in history. So yes. But again, a modest start back in March 1973.
But everyone you knew and everyone I knew through the 70s into the 80s would have a copy of Dark Side, right? That this is just one of those things I mean, it's one of the ways that you kind of imparted the idea that you're a kind of a serious music person, that you owned a copy of that album.
I think that's right. Yeah.
Yeah.
The next day, The Captain and Me by Doobie Brothers came out. Was their 3rd studio album.
It's a big one for them, though. It's kind of a transition point for them.
Included Long Train Running, China Grove, Without You, and this is certified double platinum. On the 6th, Tom Waits' debut album, Closing Time, came out. On the 7th, Bird's final studio album came out, their 12th. And after that, they went their separate ways.
Right.
On the 8th, Paul McCartney is fined £240 after pleading guilty to charges of growing marijuana outside of his Scottish farm.
Mm-hmm.
On the 23rd, Roxy Music's 2nd album, For Your Pleasure, came out.
The last one with Eno. Yep.
On Island Records, right?
Yeah.
The last one to feature Eno. On the 24th, Lou Reed was bitten on the butt by a fan during a concert in Buffalo.
Well, it couldn't have happened to a nicer fellow, but anyway.
On the 26th, a Swedish group by the name of ABBA put out their first studio album, Ring Ring.
Mm-hmm. They won't win They won't win. Sorry to interrupt. They won't win Eurovision until I think that's the next year
with Waterloo.
With Waterloo, right? And so they released the album, but it's Waterloo that then breaks them as a huge band. Yeah.
Yes. This was a chart-topping album in Belgium. Also a big success in the Netherlands and Norway and South Africa.
Which is, I think, part of the reason why they did so well in Eurovision, because they were a kind of established kind of act in a way. Yeah, kind of.
Houses of the Holy came out on the 28th. The Zeppelin's 5th album on Atlantic Records.
probably lots of people's second favorite,
Um,
maybe third favorite album, right? That this is one of those. I mean, it's a terrific album. It's got that terrible reggae song on it, but but it's a
it
great
also
album.
has the song Remains the Same, the Rain song,
Oh,
No Quarter.
it's chocked full of great songs. And then it's got that reggae song, but and a very peculiar album. Check out our rock art uh, hypnosis. I think this is in the Objectionables.
No, I think
Um,
no, it's the first one. It's the
it's the first one. It's in the first rock art.
this was the first cover that Hypnosis did for
Oh, you're right.
something.
That's it. Yeah, this is there's a great story behind that. Check out that rock art volume 1.
Absolutely. Same day, 28th, Billion Dollar Babies came out, which was the
Alice
sixth
Cooper.
the sixth and last oh, I'm sorry. No. That came
It's
later in the year.
that
So
came
this
later,
was the
but yeah.
first Alice Cooper band album of 73, the sixth of theirs total, and it became their best-selling
And
record
I
at the
think
time of its
and I
release.
think it's yeah, and I think it's probably the of the original band, it's their best album. Bob Ezrin produces it. It's really quite good.
So that's
Yeah,
music for March.
it's awesome. Yeah. So let's go to April if we could. So April, early April, April 4th, in New York City, an event. People have been kind of looking at this for years at this point. But on the 4th of April, then the World Trade Center opens, and there for a short time, the World Trade Center becomes the world's tallest set of buildings. Um,
And would continue to be for a little less than a month.
that's right. Yeah, yeah. And then those folks in Chicago, but it was I think it was a somewhat controversial building architecturally. It was people didn't necessarily love it. They didn't necessarily love it. In fact, I think people found it kind of off-putting. Obviously, all of that changes after the events of September 11th,
Well,
2001.
and part of it had to do with a New York skyline that was classic, right?
That's right. That's
And
exactly right.
was completely refigured by the World Trade Center. And I think a lot of people that was the objection of a lot of people, I think.
I think that's well said. In a few months before the building opened, a French trapeze artist, Philippe Petit, um, made his way to the top. He and some compatriots to the top of the building and shot an arrow between the two buildings and established a kind of guideline. And he walked. He did the old walk across the two buildings before he was arrested.
Whoa.
And there's a terrific film of that. But the Trade Center then would be a kind of it would certainly be part of a landmark in New York City. But I think, as you're suggesting, Dave, it wasn't necessarily a beloved landmark. Again, everything around 2001, right? The September 11th changes that. And today, it's that is sacred space in New York City for sure.
Right.
On the 15th, Nixon learns. Go ahead. What? No, I don't want to.
Just a couple days later,
Go for it.
NASA launches Pioneer 11
Oh
on
yeah.
a mission to study the solar system, and by all accounts, a very successful mission in the end.
Yeah, the NASA. I mean, so NASA at this point, you've got a space station. You've also got these deep space probes. NASA has also been announced a year earlier, so a project involving a reusable rocket of sorts. We would later learn to be the space shuttle. But I think it's fair to say, Dave, that NASA in this era is, well, they don't necessarily have the public's imagination. There's something
No, they're
about
looking.
that.
Yeah, they're looking.
They're searching,
that,
right?
That will give them some good PR again.
And they never really find it. I mean, candidly,
No.
they never really. I mean, nothing really will ever top Apollo, which I guess is probably not a great surprise.
Yeah, but
Mid
you might argue, or I might argue, that NASA's failure here is more of a failure of the American imagination than it is of the space agency.
I think that that's fair. Oh yeah. I mean, it's these deep space probes, for example, the Pioneers, are unbelievable. I mean, they go for decades, and they're transmitting data. It's just sort of beyond imagination. But right, I think that's a fair assessment. Um, on the 15th, so on the 15th of April, the new Attorney General, relatively new Attorney General, Richard Kleindienst, who had taken over for one John Mitchell, has a meeting with the president and informs Nixon that, the White House counsel, John Dean, has been cooperating with the Justice Department, and that the Justice Department is also is opening an investigation against his domestic affairs advisor, John Ehrlichman, and his chief of staff, one H.R. Haldeman. And in this photograph, one can only imagine they're shaking hands there in a simpler time, that phone is probably bugged, right? So in the Oval Office, so but this is this is really a critical moment, because then 2 weeks later, Nixon will fire Dean unceremoniously, and will then ask for and receive then the resignations of Ehrlichman and Haldeman, really the men that are closest to him in the White House. And so this is late April. And again, the astounding thing to me is that Nixon still believes that he can, in fact, sort of ride out this Watergate thing. That key members of administration are being investigated. Key members of administration are, resigning. There's a Senate investigation. The feds are, and yet, I mean, it's just extraordinary that Nixon believes that, in fact, he's untouchable on some level.
When the game starts to go against you, you may have to sacrifice a couple pawns. But that generally should be enough. And it's the arrogance of power that
is the arrogance of power.
And the arrogance of power comes to be because these people so seldom have to actually be held liable for what they do.
Well, okay.
It doesn't happen very often.
It doesn't happen very often, but it happened to Nixon in the 50s, when Eisenhower almost pulled his support for Nixon as VP, based
Thank
upon...
God for checkers.
And yeah, but thank God for checkers, right? And so Nixon, bared his soul to the American people. Pat has a fine cloth Republican coat. We're not giving back the dog. All of that. I mean, Nixon has sort of seen this play out before, and I guess to your point, he was able to sort of kind of do what he needed to do. But God, it's unbelievable that all this stuff is swirling about the White House, and there he is. He's bunkered in.
Well, I think,
and he will remain bunkered in for a year more than a year.
I think his idea was, if he gets these resignations, he can still position himself as the man who's making a clean sweep.
I think that's right.
He's investigations are being done. The responsible people are being found, and they are being removed. And
right.
And so now everything's okay.
Yeah.
I think that's the idea.
That's right. And the very fact that these guys are so close to, they're his most intimate advisors. The fact that he has asked for and received the resignations, that suggests that Nixon's serious about getting to the bottom of this. And he's serious about making that clean sweep. He's serious about, getting to the truth. Because look, he's fired these people who are close to him, which actually sort of works in his favor. The fact that, whew, man, I tell you what, it's really something.
It really is. Yeah.
What else is happening in April of '73?
Well, of course, at the end of April, well, all right, you've already talked about the resignation of Haldeman and Ehrlichman. Let's talk a little bit about music. In April, we have the Capitol Records putting out the Red and Blue albums. These
Those are,
greatest hits
yes,
compilations of the
those are
Beatles.
really, yeah, those are really important.
1962 to 66 and 67 to 1970. And these were the first Beatles albums that I owned.
Right. I think you were like many people.
Yeah, and certainly I remember my friend Jeff Reed, who we've also interviewed.
All right. Check out the Music Makers episode with Jeff. Yeah.
We'd go to his place and he'd put on his 62 to 66 album. He'd get the blue one a little bit later. And there were songs on there that I knew most of these songs. I just had no idea that they were from the Beatles.
Right.
Because I would hear these songs on my dad's albums from Frank Sinatra and Dean Martin and
exactly right.
You know,
we've been
so
covering the Beatles
songs
for years. Yeah, covered the Beatles for years, and but wait, this is the original.
This is the Beatles did that. Okay,
oh yeah.
So that was my awakening to the Beatles was back in Jeff Reed's room, listening to his Red album. And it just went on from there, of course. On the 16th, Paul McCartney had his first solo television special, James Paul McCartney.
This is a strange one.
On ABC. It was a bit strange. I think they sang My Love live.
That's right, he did. Yes.
It was okay. But it included performances, of course, by McCartney and Wings. They were trying to establish Wings as a known quantity.
That's right. That was, I think, the basis, the impetus for the special. My new band. Yeah. And not everybody was on board, but yeah.
A day later, in 17th, Desperado came out, the second studio album of the Eagles.
You know, that's go ahead. That's an album that didn't do much. It's probably the most divisive album in the Eagles catalog. Probably. A concept album, Wild West Outlaws. They were warned not to do it. Many people didn't hear a single on it. I mean, as it turned out, it didn't really generate. I mean, Desperado became a kind of classic. And the Eagles being the Eagles.
Was not the song Desperado was not released as a single.
That's right.
Although it did become, as you said, one of their signature songs.
Isn't it? I think it's Henry Diltz, right, who takes the photographs for this, and so they played cowboy at an old kind of ghost town, and they also sort of they're the Dalton brothers and all this, and so there's all sorts of images in there with them. With guns, Jackson Brown participates in this. I think J.D. Souther also is part of this.
Yeah, kind of that. Yeah,
but this was also. I mean, what's the 70s? It
was kind of a clique that was together.
No, that's right. Yeah, that they were. Yes, and so, but this is also the era where wouldn't that be cool if? And so they just follow through with it.
But Tequila Sunrise, for instance, that's a song that every Eagles fan knows. But it only made it to 64 on the single split.
That's right. It didn't really do beans. I mean, in the year, it was really considered a kind of failure, and it helped then to spawn a change in recording. Got a new producer out of the. I mean, a lot of things changed based upon sort of the album kind of fell flat. It wasn't a big hit.
But by 2001. It had certified double platinum.
Right. So,
but that's based on the strength. That's based on the strength of their later success.
So exactly right.
Of their first greatest hits album, for instance.
Yes. So I think for many people, it's one of the later albums they ever bought. Right. That they come back to. Come back to
Desperado. Exactly.
Yeah. Completist kind of thing.
2 days later, Aladdin Sane.
That's it. Yeah.
Bowie's sixth studio album for RCA. It's a follow-up to his Rise and Fall of Ziggy Stardust and the Spiders from Mars. So a big uh,
It's a huge,
album
yeah.
as well.
This is, I mean, this is Bowie cementing himself as, I mean, this is the legend of Bowie. This is where the legend sort of becomes cemented with these songs. Um, this era, this is where it all happens.
And I think Genie was
Oh
one of
yeah.
the big
Oh,
hits off of
oh
that.
yeah.
And, so yeah. On the 30th, Red Rose Speedway.
Yeah.
Wings' second studio album. At that point, credited to Paul McCartney in Wings, so that
This
people
is,
would know who the hell Wings is. It's
yeah,
Paul
this is the,
McCartney's new band.
they played this game, yeah, Wings, Paul McCartney Wings. It's a it's a modestly more successful album than the first Wings album. I think first Wings album is Wildlife.
Yes,
Red Rose Speedway actually has singles, I think so.
like My Love.
Yeah. So there we go.
Um,
Yeah.
and uh, they had Give Ireland Back to the Irish, banned by the BBC, and Paul McCartney said, boy, if I could get the BBC to ban more of my songs, I would do it. It's
Right.
nothing can
Well,
lead to a song's success like a BBC band.
well, quite frankly, a rare political moment, songwriting moment for McCartney. I mean, he would be political, but it would oftentimes be veiled. But there was nothing veiled about this song. There
No,
was nothing
no.
subtle about it or nuanced. Yeah.
It was originally planned as a double album, but condensed to a single LP.
Well,
That's
a
a
wise
request of
move,
EMI. So yeah,
a wise move, but an unusual one in this era, especially McCartney. You think if somebody wanted a double album, you would have the clout to do what he wanted, but I think a wise move.
I think if he had been really sold on it, he could have done that. I think
So
the fact that didn't happen probably was one of those things where he said, "Yeah, okay, yeah,
just occurred to me. I mean, other than Wings Across America, which I guess is a 3 album set, I don't know that McCartney ever released in the Wings era a double album,
huh,
which is a little surprising. I think that's right.
I think that's right. That sounds right to me." Yeah.
I mean, because he was so prolific and he had so much clout. I mean, nobody would have told him no, but I guess EMI told him no. It's interesting. I don't know. Yeah. Good.
Also in March, or sorry, in April, we had the album's Danny's Song by Anne Murray, her seventh studio album. We have Diamond Girl, Steels and Crofts, their fifth studio album, peaking at number 4 on the US album charts. Eat It by Humble
Oh,
Pie.
yeah. That's a
That
pretty
was a
good
double
album.
album that peaked at number 13 on the Billboard 200.
Well, right. Humble Pie is releasing double albums. McCartney, the Humble Pie, that's a little bit under the radar in the United States, but that's a terrific group.
Last but not least, the Marshall Tucker Band, the
Oh,
eponymous debut album. So
I wonder if that features
that's
"Heard It on a Love Song." I'm not sure, but got a soft spot for Marshall Tucker.
yeah, I did too.
Yeah, nothing like a flute. Well, okay, well, so there we go.
That's April.
Let's jump to May. And so in early May, the 4th of May, the reign of as you alluded to a minute ago, the reign of the World Trade Center as the tallest building in the United States, if not the world, ends as the Sears Tower opens in Chicago. And then it has I mean, this thing goes back, changes quite frequently in this era, but there for a time it is the world's tallest building. I think more importantly, it was home to one of the the United States' most important companies. There was a time in the United States when Sears was, synonymous with retail. And if you wanted to know how the United States economy was doing, well, you checked on how Sears was doing. And so Sears was not the first company to have mail order catalogs, but it really kind of pioneered the mail order concept. And that really, from the late 19th century through much of the 20th century, Sears was where America shopped, right? And so this was a kind of flagship company in the way that General Electric was a flagship company and so on in the United States. It is fascinating that over the past 50 years, Sears has just basically collapsed into a shell of itself at that. And the whole notion of retail has changed so dramatically. I mean, basically Sears, they rode almost every new wave, right? And so Sears, mail order, Sears Main Street, Sears anchoring malls. I mean, Sears was, out in front in lots of areas, but they couldn't make the transition into the late 20th and early 21st century, and they've just sort of come apart. But so it's, of course, the building still stands. It is the just forgotten the name. It's
yeah, it's no longer referred to as Sears Tower.
It's the Willis Tower, I think.
I think that's right, Willis. Yeah,
yeah. So which doesn't have,
and still the dominant building in the Chicago.
It is. I mean, there's no question about that. So let's see. Oh yeah. So we won't really know this until later in the summer, but on the 5th of May, the United States is starting to. They're starting to get horse racing fever. The horse racing in the United States at one time was really one of the biggest sports in the country, but it's kind of taken a lull for a couple of decades, in part because there hadn't been a Triple Crown winner. But on the 5th of May, Secretariat wins the Kentucky Derby and would go on then to crush horses at the Preakness and the Belmont and become the first Triple Crown winner in many, many, many years. And it didn't just win races, but it set records when it won races. And even sort of kind of non-sports fans.
It won one of those by like 15 lengths.
That was just extraordinary. Right? Like you couldn't even within the camera, you couldn't see it. The other horses you couldn't see because Secretariat was so far ahead. It was the horse. I think it remains in many ways the horse that other horses are measured by, and the distinctive.
The one horse whose name I know.
It's a big, yeah. I don't
think I could name another Kentucky Derby horse, but Secretariat.
It very much captured the public's imagination, and people in the United States and really around the world followed Secretariat's Triple Crown glory. It, horse racing, its high water mark in the United States was really the early 20th century, alongside sports like baseball and boxing. And they're just, every once in a while, there'll be a horse that comes along that, will capture the American imagination for just a minute, but nothing's really come close to Secretariat. It really was, like you said, it's the only horse that by name, and I think is true for many people.
Oh, except for Seabiscuit, but that was a movie horse, right?
Well, but a real horse, I think. I'm not sure. Definitely a movie horse. 7th of May, the Wounded Knee standoff ends in South Dakota, and candidly becomes kind of the beginning of the end for the American Indian movement. The American Indian movement still exists, but the publicity generated by the events at Alcatraz in the late 1960s and Wounded Knee in 1973, the Indian activists would struggle to get that kind of traction again. I got something for you. So it's tennis was also back in the day a big sport, and relatively big sport. And in this era, this was also the era of women becoming more assertive, more independent, more public. And so you had this.
Hear me roar.
So he had this figure in tennis, a guy by the name of Bobby Riggs. He was a big player in the 30s and 40s. So he had been a couple of decades removed from any kind of whatever. But he starts to sort of make a name for himself by challenging women. And his assertion was that there's no way that a woman can play with men, and that, you know, and so he took it upon himself to sort of kind of assert this point. So he challenges the world's #1 player in May 13th, an Australian named Margaret Court, and they play what was known as then as the Battle of the Sexes. And Riggs thrashes her, really humiliates her. I mean, it's, if you look at it, he's toying with her on the court, and it's kind of ugly in a way. But he uses this as a kind of personal platform to assert sort of men power, I guess. Now, Riggs was a degenerate gambler, and there's a lot of conversation even today about Riggs's debts, and, you know, he was playing these matches in order to raise money to help pay off debt. There's always a lot of hubbub surrounding Riggs, and he was a kind of con man, a kind of hustler. And in fact, that's how he made his living. For decades, he gambled. He'd play tennis, he played pool, he'd play whatever, name a sport. If you could bet on it, he'd play it, and he'd play you for money. Well, I mean, this then sets up then in a few months then the Battle of the Sexes 2, where Riggs challenges Billie Jean King, and King just beats the hell out of him. But first you have the battle with Margaret Court, which Riggs comes out on top. The 17th is the first day that the Senate Watergate Committee, May 17th is the first day that the Senate Watergate Committee meets in full session, and full session also means a televised full session. All three networks cover this event, and this is really kind of, this hasn't really happened in the United States since the Army McCarthy hearings of the 50s. And at the center of the Watergate Committee was one Sam Ervin, who's actually literally in the middle of this photograph. Senator Ervin from North Carolina, longtime member of the Senate, was a civil rights opponent. He was a strong advocate for states' rights, and he had done what he could, and he could do a lot to scuttle civil rights legislation, both at the state level and at the federal level. He is transformed, however, during these hearings into a kind of folk hero, kind of folk hero, a kind of droll, kind of humorous, no nonsense, aw shucks kind of figure that Americans just kind of glommed onto. If there was a kind of breakout star from the Senate Watergate hearings, it was clearly Sam Ervin. His reputation was completely transformed, and to the point where he's almost unrecognizable. So the Sam Ervin coming from the committees is almost unrecognizable to the Sam Ervin of the 50s and 1960s, who was deeply problematic from the civil rights perspective. Eventually, the networks would take turns televising this. They wouldn't all televise it at once. And a fledgling public broadcasting system would then broadcast each day session in full in the evening. And so Americans had the opportunity to follow these hearings very closely, and they did follow these hearings very closely, and they didn't disappoint. But the first hearing is held then on the 17th. And last thing I have here is that on the 25th of May, Richard Nixon had had enough of one Richard Kleindienst, who was not doing enough to slow down these investigations. And he hired instead Elliot Richardson, who had been a long time government servant, and who Nixon believed would be somebody who could be kind of frankly easily bullied. And that wouldn't be the case. But Elliot Richardson becomes Attorney General of the United States on the 25th, May 25th. What else is happening in May, Dave?
Well, we go back a couple weeks to the 14th, Skylab is launched. So there would be a number of manned missions to Skylab before its orbit deteriorated and it crash landed back on Earth. The idea was that it was that its component parts would incinerate on entry, and
That was the thought. That was the
yeah,
hope.
and anything that did not would land harmlessly somewhere in one of the oceans. That didn't quite work out, but it did. The crash in the end did not have any victims, so I guess all's well that ends well.
That's right. But Skylab was billed to Americans as sort of the next kind of the logical next extension of outer space exploration, in that there would be, kind of commercial applications possible in a space station, that you would be able to do things, medical kinds of experiments could be accomplished at zero G, that things you just couldn't accomplish on Earth. And again, the idea was that this was kind of the first step of making space a kind of industrial setting. We're still waiting for that, by the way. But I mean, right, Skylab was really the push here was the idea that this isn't just exploration for exploration's sake, but there will be sort of tangible benefits that come from this. And
Well, and I think if you listen to the scientists, that has been the case. I think
I think that's right. Yeah.
scientists are, for the most part, very satisfied with science that's been done in not just Skylab, of course, but in our space stations.
Agreed. Yeah.
After Skylab, of course, those were collective um, projects with Russia, with China, with our various European partners. But
That's right.
Skylab was the first American space labs.
There we go. So should we jump to June? And if
Let's talk a little bit about music.
Oh yeah, sorry, let's do it. Music in May.
Led Zeppelin started their 3-month tour of the United States, and this is May 4th. The very next day at Tampa Stadium in Tampa, they set the record for the highest attendance for a concert, previously held by the Beatles with 55,600 at Shea Stadium on August 15th, 1965. With 56,800, Zeppelin beat that.
Right.
And during this 3-month tour, performances for the movie, The Song Remains the Same, are also filmed.
Well,
May 7th, Daltrey, Roger Daltrey's debut solo album came out. And with that, Daltrey was the third member of The Who to come out with a solo album. The bulk of the songs were written by David Courtney and Leo Sayer.
The one, the only. Yes.
The one, the only. Anyway, it was recorded during the hiatus of the Who's touring schedule. And the first single from the album, Giving It All Away, reached number 5 in the UK. And the album itself made the top 50 in the United States. On the 12th, David Bowie is the first rock artist to perform at Earl's Court Exhibition Centre in London. The Carpenters released their 5th studio album on the 16th, Now and Then. The title, suggested by Karen and Richard's mother, Agnes, was taken from a leftover song that did not appear on the album. Agnes
always had her say.
Agnes kept her fingers.
She did.
So on the 18th, Yes Songs appeared. That was the first of many live albums.
Oh my Lord!
Of the band, yes.
Again,
album.
My gosh.
This was never a reductionist group. The idea was always more is better.
More of
Uh,
everything. Yeah.
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 So
Yeah.
that's reflected by Yes Songs. And Yes Songs was certified platinum in 1998. So there you go.
There we go. So,
25th, Tubular Bells by Mike Oldfield was released on
so yeah. So
Virgin Records.
yeah. So
It
I think
was
this is. Yeah. Go ahead, Dave. I think
it was Virgin Records' first album, the
first
first one
album.
that
Yeah.
they
Right.
released.
So this is Richard Branson, who started small. I mean, he was a record store entrepreneur. Ventured then to the music label business, and then sort of went well beyond that. This becomes a really important record, not only for Virgin and Mike Oldfield, but it also, I think, it's a sidelong track. Tubular Bells is a sidelong track. I think this is side one. Then a condensed version of that then becomes the theme to The Exorcist, which will be released in December of 1973. I mean, and this is
And
it's kind of groundbreaking.
that really drove sales of the album.
It no question, right? No question. And so in a way, the album is a slow burn until Exorcist is released, and then everybody wants a copy of Tubular Bells. It's really quite a groundbreaking album with Oldfield playing all the instruments on the Tubular Bells on the title track.
I still play that occasionally. I still occasionally have I'm in the mood for Tubular Bells.
And it's Viv Stanfield or somebody, I think that's right, who announces at the end of the of that, near the end of that, he announces the instruments. So
Yes.
Glockenspiel and all that. But yeah, Tubular Bells, Virgin's first release.
Sold more than 15 million copies worldwide.
Oh yeah, yeah.
How old do you think he was when he released that?
He was a kid, because he's not, I mean, so he must have been in his early 20s, maybe.
He was 19 years old.
Yeah, I was gonna say, because he's not, yeah, 19.
That's just
That's
incredible.
that's precocious talent.
That's precocious, absolutely. On the 30th, Living in the Material World was released.
Oh, there we go. Harrison's is
fourth studio album.
It's peak Harrison time.
It is
right?
Harrison time. And that's absolutely right. This was the follow-up to All Things Must Pass.
Yep.
And his concert for Bangladesh. Give Me Love and Give Me Peace on Earth was the big hit off of it.
Huge song. Right.
So yeah, Harrison's doing really well, and not just on his own stuff, but also helping out elsewhere, producing and writing songs for people like Ringo Starr and so on.
That's right.
Other songs from the month, There Goes Ryman Simon, Paul Simon's third solo album, Honey in the Rock by Charlie Daniels with the Uneasy Rider single.
So he's such an interesting, I mean, it's so interesting in this era. He's got his foot in two worlds. I mean, Charlie Daniels is fascinating.
Yes. Fascinating. Yeah. And last but not least, the eponymous debut album of the Pointer Sisters.
Quite a good number, quite a good release, and they'll have a really quite a sparkling career through the early 80s. Yeah, no question.
So,
good.
There we go.
Well, let's if we could let's jump to June, first thing I want to mention is June 18th. Do you have anything from earlier in June?
Sure. The first automatic teller machine was patented on June 4th. Big
I remember
stuff.
Big stuff. Yes. So again, being old, I do remember my first encounter with an automatic teller machine was in the late 70s, a few years after this.
Yes.
It seemed, I don't know. It was so cool, but yet so strange. But yeah,
there's something almost magical about it.
Magical, yeah. It's spitting out money.
June 9th, we talked about Secretariat. Secretariat won Belmont Stakes by 31 lengths.
Yeah, this is the thing. Yeah, that's
31 lengths.
That's like a quarter of the track or something. It's unbelievable. Yeah.
And with that had the Triple Crown. And that's the first time one horse had won all of the Triple Crown races since 1948.
That's the thing. Yeah. And so that's a big part of the Secretariat excitement, was that it hadn't happened for decades. But then the other piece of it was that she arguably is maybe the greatest horse of all time, just given how she was winning, just crushing the opposition.
On June 16th, Nixon begins talks with Leonard Brezhnev.
Yeah, and so that's where I want to. Yeah, so right, and so the Nixon Brezhnev connection was, I think, surprisingly warm. Um, at least they gave all appearances. Leader to leader diplomacy is most effective when the leaders at least can pull off some sort of affability.
Well,
And
there seems to be more of a rapport there than with Khrushchev back in the kitchen
yeah,
dialogues or whatever they're called.
yeah, yeah. That's right. No, that's a fair point. This is again another, I think, Nixon success. As well, to your point about Khrushchev, as frosty as relations were between the United States and the Soviet Union were in the early '60s, they were as warm in the early '70s. These were superpowers that seemed to be able to sort of do business together. These leaders certainly seemed to enjoy each other. Famously, Nixon and Brezhnev spent time on Nixon's yacht in the Potomac, the Sequoia, tooling around, drinking beer, that kind of thing. Maybe scotch, who knows? But drinking for sure. And they seemed. I think what mattered to people was that it gave people a kind of sense of relief that the relationship between these two countries had been so bad, so toxic, that people just like, yeah, okay, that we feel better about this. And again, I think it's clear it's another success for Nixon.
A frigid Cold War between two nuclear powers.
That's right.
Where we had already seen near misses that we in some cases didn't even realize were near misses until decades later. But the idea is, if things go bad, they could go really, really bad.
That's right.
And so this period of détente was another brilliant diplomatic success with the Kissinger-Nixon team.
Undeniable. It's undeniable, right? It was a success on top of a success on top of success. I mean,
so the 1970s were, because of Kissinger and Nixon, I think undeniably because of them, a period of short relaxation in an otherwise pretty nasty Cold War.
Pretty nasty. And again, things would both heat up and cool down during the 1980s. But the talk was an undeniable success for Nixon and Kissinger. On the 22nd, in what seemed to be fairly minor, is maybe a little overstated, but there had been a bit of a leadership kerfluffle in the FBI, and a reasonably high-ranking FBI official, a guy by the name of Mark Felt, stepped down, and here he is giving a short press conference. What we learned later, much later, 2005, in fact, is that Mark Felt was in fact Deep Throat. He was in fact the figure who was supplying Carl Bernstein and Bob Woodward with information about Watergate, and giving them reasonably specific instructions as to where to look, to follow the money, this kind of thing. And we would learn this only after Felt gave his, I guess, permission in the last months of his life to have this released.
Yeah, it was a mystery for a couple of decades.
Right? Oh yeah, and so there was this cottage industry of trying to figure out who Felt was, and certainly Nixon had his, he was interested, and there were some people who had centered on him. But most people did not have Felt in their sights, so it came as a surprise to many people that Felt, in fact, was the infamous Deep Throat.
And it's been suggested that he had no interest whatsoever in bringing Nixon down. In fact,
Right.
having
That's
Nixon president is kind of the prerequisite for him being placed back at the top of the
that's
FBI, which is
exactly right.
what his long game was.
That's what his game was. Yeah.
And it was a total miscalculation on his part from apparently everything that we know, because it did not work out the way he wanted it.
But imagine, right. But imagine had Felt chosen not to share information. I mean, he was really instrumental in guiding that investigation and that that material publicized. Nixon would have served out both terms without Mark Felt.
Conceivably, anyway.
Yeah, and so again, sort of in a roundabout way, and maybe
All
not
the
exactly what he
President's Men
intended.
would not have been published.
Well, it certainly wouldn't have, right? And that story in the Washington Post would have gotten much further than a kind of two-bit break-in and that kind of thing. And it's one of those vagaries of history. It's interesting who plays roles, and Felt ended up being instrumental.
Yeah, it's just the
fundamental to
influence
the
or
Watergate.
the impact that one individual can have, and really be a game changer.
Well, right, exactly. And to that point, then I think you could add one John Dean to that list. And so on the 25th of June, John Dean, the former counsel to the president, testified before the Watergate Committee. This had been anticipated for several weeks. I think a lot of people, well, certainly Nixon was concerned about what Dean was going to say. And I think a lot of people thought that Dean had plenty to say, and he didn't really disappoint. He famously gave in his this on the 25th a 7-hour long kind of dissertation of everything that he knew about Watergate. And then in the subsequent days, then in back and forth with the committee, we learned a fair amount more about Nixon and Watergate. And I mean, this is the famous phrases comes from this time of there's a cancer on the presidency that that Dean shared this with the president. It's again, I think to many people, Dean became a kind of hero, but there were plenty of people who thought of him as something again close to a traitor, much in the way that Ellsberg was sort of held in low esteem by many people. Dean's still with us some 50 years later. One of the curious things about John Dean is he had a kind of renaissance or a kind of reemergence during the Trump impeachment investigations when he became a kind of go-to figure. One of the things that we learned, though, during Dean's testimony, we learned a lot of things during Dean's testimony, but one of the things we learned was that Nixon had compiled a so-called enemies list. Now, this didn't come as a surprise to anybody who knew much about Nixon, who was one to, as they say, hold a grudge. But the length of such a list was, I think, a real surprise to people. And so, as we learned in the subsequent months, Nixon had dozens and dozens and dozens of people from every walk of life, it seemed, as a part of the enemies list. Here is a political cartoon in the days following Dean's testimony. And I think that's about right. His own worst enemy.
His own worst enemy. That says it all.
It's just, it's clear that the as you talked about earlier, sort of the personal demons of Nixon are really consuming him, right? Really consuming him. I mean, he just is no longer able then. I mean, he's such a deft politician and he was so skilled in so many ways, but he couldn't get out of his own way. And so it became clear, I think, by sort of the summer of 73, that Nixon was in deep trouble. And the principal reason Nixon was in deep trouble was because of Nixon. Now, we would learn even more about this in a few weeks, but my God, the Dean testimony really, I think, changed the nature of the investigation. I think it changed the tenor of public opinion regarding Watergate. I think it gave the Watergate Committee even more confidence to drill deeper.
Well, look,
Dean delivered.
If Nixon and the people around him had even taken time to pause and say, all right, we can do the dirty tricks campaign and we know how, but do we need to? Is it strategically necessary? Do we get something of value more than what we lose? Those questions were never asked.
Never asked.
It was
It's clear
just
they were never
always
asked. Yeah.
assumed if we can get something any way we can, then we should do it. And so it
Right.
was just kind of
That's right.
a default setting. And when you look at the man won by a landslide, there was no need for them to do any of that stuff. And if they
But
had,
this is right.
Nixon would have had a legacy, a shining legacy.
I think this is where, right. And I think this is where Nixon surrounding himself with sycophants, I think, really comes to the fore, right? Because um, to some degree, in the Nixon White House, loyalty was at least as important as competence. And so
Well, you had
everybody,
people that were similarly paranoid and
well, fair enough, right?
poisons, like
But
Mitchell or some people like
certainly Pat Buchanan, people like that, no question. But you just needed a kind of independent voice within that in the room, and there just wasn't one. In the end,
and
everybody
he didn't want one.
he didn't really. No, he certainly didn't. Nope. I mean, a few people do, right? But had he had one, he might have been able to avoid this. I mean, because as you're suggesting, it's just I mean, it's the great own goal, right? It's the great own goal in American politics.
Yeah.
What else is happening? What else is happening in June?
On June 24th, the upstairs lounge arson attack resulted in a fire at a gay bar in New Orleans, French Quarter. It killed 32 people. Yeah. And otherwise, we're looking at music.
What happened to music in June?
June 1st, the second studio album by glam rocker Glitter, Touch Me, came out. Boy,
what an unfortunate title.
Yeah, Gary Glitter is just such a slimy guy. It's hard to watch the videos that he made. It's just like, oh God, it's just. But love the song. I really like the song. So he did make a couple songs that I like, but I just it's impossible to watch him. June 4th, Ronnie Lane played his last show with the Faces at Edmonton Sundown in London.
He's the first that pulled out, right? He'd had enough.
Yeah. On the 18th, The Smoker You Drink, The Player You Get. Second studio album by Joe Walsh, including his single Rocky Mountain Way.
Yeah, which becomes sort of his, right? It becomes his signature song, I think. Still plays it. Still plays it. He still plays it with the Eagles. And the Eagles play it.
Well, Walsh is a fun guy. He has some fun songs. On the 22nd, Touch Me in the Morning, fourth studio album by Diana Ross. And that, of course, includes her #1 single of the same name. And the album peaked at #5 on the Billboard 200s chart.
Which is about as good as it. I mean, she had kind of middling success. It'd at least been up and down, or down and up. So that's,
Yes. On the 25th, Chicago 6 came out. Strangely enough, their 5th studio album.
Yeah, this is where.
And that's double platinum, and included Just You and Me. That's it. And Jesus Christ Superstar also came out in the month. So
this was that was the film version.
That was the film version. Sorry, that also came out on the 25th. The film version of the musical.
Yeah, that was. I remember that was quite an event. Again, because most people obviously were not going to be able to see the what was happening on stage, whether in London or New York, and so it was quite shocking to many people who were sort of entranced by the album. The visuals Yeah, it was I think it was a tough sell to many religious folks who thought it was going to be one thing, but they saw something quite different.
Glenn Campbell came out this year with "I Knew Jesus Before He Was a Star," which was obviously a reference to Jesus Christ Superstar.
Absolutely, yeah. Sounds like something should have been penned by Chris Christopherson, by the way.
Yeah. On the 29th, the Scorpions played their first gig with Uli Roth at a festival in Vechta, Germany.
They'd have they would have quite a career, right? And they had a kind of yeah, for metalheads, Scorpions, yeah, they were big.
Well, yeah, the most successful international German band that I
Oh,
can think of so
yes, I
far.
think that's yeah, absolutely right.
Anyway, Roth was originally intended as a temporary replacement for Michael Schenker, who had been
Yeah, the
snapped
Schenker,
up by
yeah,
UFO.
yeah, the Schenkers, yeah, they were, yeah. UFO is also an interesting group in those early years. Both could rock.
And on the 30th, Ian Gillan quits Deep Purple. That's the month of music for
That's
June
good.
1973.
And at this
And
point, I said we should wrap.
let's
Wrap this
that's
up.
the first half of the year,
Yeah,
1973. And we'll be continuing this in our next video. But if you enjoyed this video, we hope you did, you can give us a thumbs up. We always appreciate that. You can subscribe here if you haven't done that yet. Watch one of our 50 years ago this month videos right up here.
that's right.
And as always, you'll want to check out our playlist right here. Got a lot of great music on this this time around. And look for our next video, 1973, second half, July through December.
That's right. And keep in mind that we tweet every day on Twitter X. And so until next time, we'll see you soon.
Bye-bye.